I'd like to welcome you to today's Tocqueville Project Lecture. I'm Chris Surprenant, Assistant Professor of Philosophy here at the University of New Orleans and Director of the Tocqueville Project. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to take a moment to thank a number of the groups that have made today's lecture possible. Those include the Department of Philosophy here at the University of New Orleans, the UNO Student Government, the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University, and the Charles Koch Foundation. We thank them for their support of our program, support of our students. Joining us today is Joshua Hall, Associate Professor of Economics at West Virginia University. Dr. Hall's areas of interest include applied microeconomics with an emphasis on economic freedom, state and local public finance, and entrepreneurship. In addition to being the author of more than 50 articles in journals such as the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Journal of Public Administration, Research and Theory, Contemporary and Economic Policy in the Southern Economic Journal, he is the co-author of the widely cited Economic Freedom of the World annual report. Today he's speaking to us on the connection between economic freedom and human well-being. Please join me in welcoming Professor Josh Hall.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here at UNO. I really love talking about this talk, especially to kind of interdisciplinary audiences, because I think this project has a lot to say for two interdisciplinary audiences, and especially because of the way it ends up, I end up looking at a lot of research across a wide variety of disciplines. So there's three main things I want to get across in my talk today. The first thing is, look, economic freedom is an important thing to measure and to measure it well. The second thing is it's not easy. As you can imagine, if I asked you kind of what is economic freedom, you'd all have a different definition. If then I say, hey, what captures your definition? Trying to find data that capture that would be very difficult to do. Talk about a little bit about what we do here in our annual report. And then one of the reasons we want to develop this report is so people can go out and test empirical relationships between our definition of economic freedom and other things you might care about. You might not care about economic freedom, but you might care about something like environmental quality. Well, it turns out researchers from any number of disciplines have looked at the relationship to economic freedom and things they care about, and I'm going to talk about that research and how it relates to well-being. And I should say, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I hate kind of saving questions to the end, because I can always remember, like, I want to ask this question, and by the time the end comes around, I don't really know how to articulate my question well. So just let me know, and we can press the buttons and ask the questions as they come along. Okay, what is really the motivation for the economic freedom of the world index? I always think about it in the context of my high school course in political philosophy, which was a lot of really just arguing from one or two data points. So we would read something, and then we'd want to kind of interpret that through the lens of our own experience. And so we would say, oh, well, let's use an example. Is central planning better than a decentralized economy? Well, I'm going to use Sweden as my example as central planning, because half of government spending is half of the economy. Okay, and I would say, and is that central planning? I don't know. Maybe if it's done in a very dispersed way, everybody has open access, right? You qualify, so it's not done in a crony extent, then maybe it's a good idea. Maybe there's differences between the size of government and the scope of government, right? The things that government engages in. Yes, it might have a large transfer sector, but maybe they don't meddle into the day-to-day affairs. So I see a lot of the Economic Freedom Index as trying to get a better sense of what does it mean to be economically free in a way that we can get past this kind of yelling about is Sweden is socialist and it's proof that socialism works, or the United States is not socialist and it's proof that free markets work. I think what will come out of my talk is we have a much better sense of which countries are economically free and which countries are not, and how that relates to other things like growth and other things people might care about. For economics, now I'm an economist, and for economists, we tend to focus on growth a lot. We focus on growth because it's something we can measure. We also focus on growth because, in some sense, it's not everything, but the wealthier we are, the more people can pursue their own ends, whatever those may be. Might be leisure, might be more time with your family, right? The wealthier we get, we can spend fewer hours working, for example. Anybody who took economics from basically the 50s onward, chances are you had a textbook that had this figure in it. It comes from Paul Samuelson's textbook, Economics. The picture shows, if we look here on the y-axis, it's starting at 100, the US GNP, gross national product, right, the output of the economy, starting at 100. And Samuelson's trying to show that the USSR has GNP at that time half of what the US is. But what's he showing with the rest? And these are projections. This comes from a 1960s era textbook. These are projections. And what's he doing? He's projecting that at their higher growth rates, the USSR is going to pass, they're going to pass the United States in terms of growth rates sometime in the late 90s. So now we have the hindsight of history to be able to explain, well, why might Samuelson have been wrong? Well, he took at face value the data he got from the we had on the USSR. We had very limited data on the USSR, but they were very good at producing things like tanks and just basic concrete, like things that are relatively simple. They weren't good at producing consumer goods, like things people on their day-to-day life might have valued. So maybe it's an error of interpretation, but there might be an error of the model. The model is one of, well, it seemed to fit with his prior that planning in certain situations, less economic freedom, might be a good thing. It might be a reason why the USSR had those growth rates. So I think measuring economic freedom is good because I'm not sure these two data points tell us anything. I'm an economist. I want to bring as much data to bear on the issue as possible. And so I want to measure economic freedom or intervention into markets for as many countries as possible. So we can see, was the USSR an anomaly? Is the US an exception? Rather than, again, arguing over a couple of data points. Finally, one of the intellectual godfathers of the economic freedom is Milton Friedman. And in his classic 1961 book, Capitalism and Freedom, he makes this claim about the relationship between political freedom and economic freedom, right? He says, I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. Later on, he would go and say, he's like, well, I mean, there are some qualifying words in there, the bulk of economic activity. I know of no example in time or place, but what does it mean to be politically free? Now, he has his own idea in his mind. Let's go out and measure those and see if there seem to be exceptions, or is it the case that political freedom and economic freedom do go together? Once we have measures of those, we can begin to empirically test that relationship. So I want to defend the thing that economic freedoms are good. Just because something has problems doesn't mean we shouldn't try to measure it. GDP has problems. If you take any basic economics class, one of the things you'll do in macro is talk about all the problems with GDP as a measuring stick of how well we're doing. For one thing, let's say we're doing really well and people want to take time off to spend more time with their families. GDP is going to fall. But we wouldn't say we're worse off just because people want to spend more time with their families. Somebody sends their kids to a daycare and then decides, no, I want to stay home with my kids. Measure GDP falls. We're not any poorer as a result of that, just we're doing less things in the market that we can measure and more things in home production. Okay? So just like GDP, there's issues, which I hope that come up during my talk, with my measurement of economic freedom, but it's still a valuable thing to measure. People seem to want it. Some people want it. One of the reasons I'm an academic is I like freedom on many dimensions. I like not having a real boss. I'm fortunate enough to be a tenured professor. I want autonomy over most of my day. I have that. I teach my courses, but the rest of the time is spent with meeting with students and things like that. I think a lot of people value that. There's other definitions, like Mill would have a definition of freedom that's different than what we have enshrined in our index, and I think those are important. And I wish somebody would try to take those and try to use those and create measures based on those. We use a negative freedom definition of liberty in our index, okay? And I want to do that because I want to know if there's trade-offs between, because not everybody values economic freedom. Are there trade-offs between our definition of economic freedom and other things that people value? Right? One of the things that in economics is the joke, it comes from a Heinlein book, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. It's in Staffel. There is no such thing as a free lunch. And that teaches you that there's always trade-offs. In the words of the economist Thomas Sowell, he says that's why people don't like economists, because we teach them that there are no solutions to problems, there's only trade-offs. I'm not sure that's quite right. Maybe economic freedom is one of those things that there might not be a lot of trade-offs to. We can have more economic freedom for those people who want that, and it tends to lead to overall flourishing, and which means people get these other things they want. I can't tell you what the optimal level of economic freedom is. So we have a scale. Higher values mean more economic freedom or less economic freedom, but that doesn't mean that more values are better in any sort of sense. That's up to you to decide. All I can say is on our ranking, these countries that have higher scores have these different results. It's up to the individuals within those societies to say what they think the good life is. So this is our index, the Economic Freedom of the World report. It comes out each year. The way we think about this, I'll get into the nuts and bolts of the data next couple of pages. I think about a representative person in a country. So there's some person in our minds when my co-authors and I put together the index. And I want to know what are the constraints placed by government on that person's economic freedom. Now, there's other important freedoms. Right? Government might put constraints on your political freedom, on your personal freedoms. We're just trying to measure economic freedom. So do you have personal choice in the marketplace? Right? Do you have the freedom to enter and compete in markets? Or do you have constraints put upon those choices? Now, I should be clear, those constraints might be important for other reasons. Like, give you an example. Regulation of barbers and cosmetologists. Maybe there's a good public interest argument for regulation of barbers and cosmetologists. That, even if there is, it's still a constraint on your economic freedom. I don't want to just measure bad constraints. Because if I measure only bad constraints on your economic freedom, if I go and then correlate that with other things, I'm only going to find good results. Instead, I want to measure all constraints on economic freedom, and then if I correlate those with things, I'm getting a true measure of the overall effect of economic freedom. We have a minimal state vision of government in this. Government should protect private property rights, provide stable monetary policy, and basically not violate the rights the economic freedoms of individuals. So, as you can imagine, kind of going from that from a kind of a negative liberty definition of economic freedom to then putting in the data is hard. There were 6 conferences by some of the top economists in the world met over almost a decade to try to come up with this measure. And lots of intense debates about whether a particular value was capturing economic freedom, how were these variables related, how should we weight them, how much. Think about what I mentioned about Sweden before. Okay, 50% of all consumption goes through collective decision making rather than individual choices, right? So it's government deciding we're going to produce this road or we're going to produce this housing or whatever it might be versus individuals doing that. How much should that be weighted? Should it be 5%? I mean, that's a big, a lot's encompassed in that, right? Should it be a quarter of the index? All these questions had to be hashed out among people like Doug North, the Nobel laureate in economics, James Buchanan, lots of other, Milt Friedman. Okay, and what we ended up with is this index where we now have 152 countries, 42 variables. I'm not going to talk about all of them. We grouped them into 5 areas, and I'll talk about the 5 areas in the next slide. One of our priorities from the beginning was transparency. You could go to all of the data. We don't create any data ourselves. We transform data. So we'll take this measure from the IMF, from the World Bank, from the Global Competitiveness Report, and we put it on our own scale as 0 to 10 scale, with 10 being higher economic freedom, 0 being less economic freedom. We tell you how exactly we transform that. Anybody can replicate exactly what we do. This is objective data. We tried to just use hard data, not use surveys at first. That's problematic. How do you measure something like very important like property rights without, there's no objectively hard data on property rights. You have to ask people, are your property rights protected? Do you think your government follows the rule of law? Are judges in your country independent, right? How much military interference is there in day-to-day life? You have to rely on survey data, okay? But again, it all comes from third parties. So we don't have to break this down, but I think analytically it's nice to think about these 5 areas of economic freedom which we weight equally. Size of government, okay? Larger governments, less economic freedom. Okay, well, I'll talk specifically what's in there, but you have things like government consumption as a percentage of total consumption, state-owned enterprises. Countries like China that have larger, have state-owned companies, or companies with heavy state involvement, or where there's lots of government investment in the economy, crowding out private investment. That's less economic freedom. Legal structure. How secure do people feel in their persons and their property? Access to sound money. So is government inflating away your wealth, your value of your earnings through high and variable rates of inflation? And one of our other measures is the freedom to own foreign currency bank accounts. If you have high and variable inflation, right, so let's say 25% inflation, which was not uncommon in the 1970s, you might want to hold some currency that's not having those rates of inflation, dollars, for example. Well, many countries make it illegal to that. You need central bank permission to hold foreign currency. Freedom to trade internationally. So we're presuming, you might say, well, one thing that's we're missing in our studies is internal barriers to trade. Those are lesser so, though. If you went back farther in time, the 16th and 17th century, there was lots of internal barriers to trade. Like you would pay more tariffs shipping something across France than you would a bottle of wine across France rather than shipping it to England. You just pay one tariff and shipping it to England, and you pay multiple tariffs shipping it across France. Those are lesser important today, so we measure these international barriers to exchange. And then finally, the regulation of credit, labor, and business. I'll have a separate point that I want to make once I'm going to delve into that. Okay, so let's look at area one. I mentioned these before: government consumption, transfers and subsidies as a percentage of GDP, government enterprises, and then finally the top marginal tax rate and the threshold at which it applies. You might think, oh, hey, you're double counting here. We have both government consumption, which government can't consume anything that it doesn't tax for, and you also have taxes. But this is a tax rate, not tax revenues. We're really trying to measure something else. We're trying to measure the deadweight loss of government taxation. So as an economist, for those of you who haven't had economics, deadweight loss is like, what are the trades that didn't happen because of the tax? Right? If I was going to, if I knew 100 people were going to buy bottles of water at $1 a piece, and we put a tax on that of $1, right? So now this bottle will be $2, and half as many people. We don't measure those 50 trades that don't happen, but those are really important, right? Those lost trades. That deadweight loss that comes from taxes is an important cost to taxation and government activity. And so we want to try to get a handle on that. And I think this highlights one of the things, like when you're dealing with data, there's very important things that you want to measure, and sometimes you can't measure them. Or sometimes you have to measure them imperfectly. And so we're always on the search for better data. Every 5 years, we kind of audit ourselves. So we hole up in a hotel room or a conference room, one of our universities, and we go through each and every variable, and we say, is this still measuring what we want? What concerns do we have? What other data is out there that could better measure this? What do we think that our data is not capturing? Just to give you an example, I'm going to throw up the top countries in the world, and some of those might jump out to you. I don't think of that place as being very free, or at least not in the top 10. And I might agree with you if that economic freedom is not universal in those countries. One of the things that I think for a subset of countries where there's a divergence between, for example, women's property rights and men's property rights, I think our measures of property rights pretty much enshrine are only measuring men's property rights. So we're inaccurately measuring overall economic freedom because we're missing, in which in some cases, the majority of the population. And we've really struggled hard with trying to find a way to systematically better reflect property rights of everybody in those societies. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem in the United States, but I'm sure it's a problem in several Middle Eastern countries. Yes?
Can you tell me a bit how you calculate deadweight loss, or how you guys try to take that into account?
So the question is the deadweight loss and how we take that into account. We're not explicitly doing that. What we're implicitly doing it through this top marginal tax rate. So think about when the EFW started, you still had many countries in the world that had top marginal tax rates above 50%. So every dollar you would make on the margin, over half of it would go to federal income tax, let alone state and local income taxes, right? If you think about the Beatles song, Taxman, right? 19 for you, 1 for me, right? That was like, Britain had a tax rate over 90%, top marginal tax rate over 90%. So you would, of every dollar the Beatles would be making, if they didn't change their tax jurisdiction, they were only keeping $1. And so that rate is trying to capture some of that lost economic activity that was happened in the context of that. Does that kind of answer your question, Chris? So it's, I think it's become less important. The deadweight loss from income taxes are lower. Now we're in range of 35, 36%.
Yeah, this is more of just a general economics question. Is there a standard across the field as to how economists try to identify what?
There is different measures of that excess burden of taxation or deadweight loss. There's kind of approximations of it. So one way of putting it, so there's a large number of studies, and depending on the estimate, it depends on how much money you're already raising. So if you're adding a tax on top of a tax, it's more destructive, for example, in terms of deadweight loss. But for example, at the federal level, I once saw a study by a Joint Economic Committee study by Richard Vedder and Lowell Galloway that summarized a bunch of scholarly papers, and they said these measures say at our current level of taxation, an additional dollar of revenue costs between 20 and 40 cents of deadweight loss. So for every additional dollar we earn, we're losing like this hidden 20 to 40 cents of economic activity. I always think of it in terms of, think about things that are banned. Okay, so deadweight loss is really these things that don't happen anymore. So if you go back to the 50s, one of the most popular games in the United States was lawn darts. Have you ever seen lawn darts? Like, it's basically a cornhole, right, beanbag toss, but with a big metal dart. And you would put a hole back there at the back of the room, and we'd chuck this big metal dart in the air and try to land it into this circle. Right? Nothing bad's going to happen. No, I mean, like some kids are not paying attention, kids are just chucking them in the air, and a handful of children died every year, and there are many emergency room visits. So they're banned. You cannot sell, you can own, but you cannot sell lawn darts in the United States. How do we measure that? Like there's a lot of it was one of the most popular games in the United States. Now people went on and did something else, and when taxes go on, people moved their activity, but it's not the same. That wasn't their preferred thing. And so I think these are tricky questions of are we really capturing that, right? Like, I don't know what the deadweight loss is from the fact that you can't buy and sell and play lawn darts. Well, you can if you know I know a few people who have some sets. But I think those are difficult issues. But nobody talks about those because it's funny, it adds a really high barrier. Like, it's not just, is this activity, do we think it's worth $1? If we're going to take $1 of public revenue, it's actually like, it needs to be worth $1.40 or $1.20 or pass that threshold. Okay. I'm going to delve in. So this is Area 5, Regulation of Credit, Labor, and Business. It's the business one. I want to highlight it for two reasons. One is we have to use multiple measures, sometimes that are overlapping. So one of the variables is called hiring regulations and minimum wage laws. One of the other one's called hiring and firing regulations. So a lot of people say, in some ways we misname this. It's regulation of business. And we're often criticized from that being pro-business. Again, I'm thinking about an individual, right? That business owner has an economic freedom to employ their capital how they want. But these are also economic freedom on the worker side. An hours regulation, again, you might be in favor of an hours regulation like France's 36-hour work week, but it's an infringement upon the economic freedom of the individual who wants to work 37 hours and legally can't. Right? Similarly, it's the person who wants to work at below minimum wage, or the person who doesn't want to be part of a national collective bargaining unit, right? Again, we might find that countries that have centralized collective bargaining do better. That's an empirical matter, but it's certainly not consistent. It's not consistent with our definition of economic freedom. I want to highlight conscription because since we've been measuring economic freedom since 1970, economic freedom's improved throughout the world. Some countries have come down, but economic freedom is generally rising. And military conscription is one of three major areas that have improved. The average country in the world had used military conscription of somewhere between 18 months and 2 years in 1970. Today, it's between 0 and 6 months. Okay, we can't get much finer than that. Unfortunately, we just have a range. And this is in part to the arguments of people like Milton Friedman and others on the benefits of a volunteer army. Similarly, marginal tax rates have come down. We don't see those 90%. We don't see those even 50% anymore. And the third area that's really improved is monetary policy. 70s, you had double-digit rates of inflation was the norm in some countries. Most central banks now, they try to keep inflation low and stable. Okay, we have now arrived. So I'm a little bit of a light opera fan. I like Gilbert and Sullivan, and if you know, so there's some Gilbert and Sullivan light operas that have very, very long openings. In particular, the Gondoliers has like a 12-minute opening. It's just music and nothing really going on. And when you'll see a local production, they'll often insert a line and say, "Finally, we have arrived at the dialogue." And they're coming off a boat at the time. So you're thinking that finally we've arrived on land, and they say the dialogue. So it always gets a little bit of a joke. Well, finally, when I'm talking to economists, finally we've arrived at the data. We're all kind of social scientists, so I always like to throw this up there and think, what are these countries, anything jump out at you? There's actually, I have to apologize, I noticed a little bit earlier, countries missing. I usually do the top 10 and then the USA, but Chile's missing. So we have Hong Kong's number one. Hong Kong and Singapore have always been in the top 3 as long as we've measured them. New Zealand, Switzerland, Mauritius, the UAE, Canada. We have a lot of islands, countries where trade is likely to be very important. We have a lot of small countries. So this suggests something I think that a lot of scholars are looking into is, in addition to measuring economic freedom, we can understand what are the conditions that foster it. It's because it's not like anybody chooses. None of us choose. It's a collective thing to get a sense of norms and institutions such that you're economically free. Right? If you think about the US, right, our great experiment in free trade zone, certainly it's informed by ideas, but we can't discount the fact that, at least in the North, chattel slavery was hard. It wasn't as productive as in the South. We had to induce free labor. How did we induce free labor? Well, we had much more extensive, we had to give people much more extensive property rights than was the norm at the time. Now, I'm not saying that property rights were widespread. Certainly, there's still a very small proportion of males that had the right to own property, but it was much more widespread than it was in other similar places at the time. Yes?
What does this data tell us about the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom? I mean, would you be able to comment on that?
Yeah, so what, is there a particular country that's jumping out?
Well, I don't know. Say Singapore, Jordan, UAE, and Mauritius are not the uppermost sort of politically free countries in the world.
Yeah, so we go back to Milton Friedman's hypothesis, right? He knows of no case. This would seem to be, now maybe we're in a window right now where it seems to me the recent protests might be an outcome that economic freedom is something that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for political freedoms, right? What do people, first we have, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we take care of basic security, we take care of our basic economic needs, and then what do we want? We want more political rights. It does seem to be the case that for most countries, on average, economic and political freedom move together, but there are some outliers. So I don't think it's a given that economic freedom and political freedom have to always go together. Generally speaking, though, the larger the country is, the more likely you are. Most of these, city-states, basically. And I think with city-states, it seems like it's a lot more fragile. And so people, the threat of democracy, I think, in many cases to people, or the threat to disrupt the economic success, which in the case of both Hong Kong and Singapore is pretty recent in many people's minds. They're not willing to upset the apple cart, right? If you listen to some of the arguments that were made about why we don't need more political freedom, it's because that's the route to our downfall, right? That being said, the relationship that Friedman talked about is pretty strong in the whole sample of all 152 countries. And there's no country that's, Israel might be, it depends on how you define economic freedom, but there's no country that's politically free in terms of having a democracy and free elections like the Freedom House would do, that's not largely economically free. Although Israel kind of, again, it depends on what threshold you use. And that just shows that, look, think about something like conscription. I might say, well, as an economist, a volunteer army is more efficient. That being said, there's economic reasons driving the countries that still use, and political reasons driving the countries that still use conscription. Israel, South Korea still has 2 years of required military service. So Chile still has conscription. Okay. So I wanted to highlight the USA is now 12th. As you go back to 2000, the US was second in the world. We've slow and steady decline over the last 12 years under both of our last two presidents. And it's not in one particular area. So we have things that make sense, like government consumption went up by 3 percentage points after the Great Recession kicked in. So kind of stimulus policy at work. And some of that's been permanent. But we've also seen tremendous declines in the rule of law, respect for property rights. It's survey-based, so I don't know what that is. Is that war on terror? Is it torture? Is it Kelo v. New London eminent domain cases? I don't know. It's surveys, right? I can't tell why, but those numbers are all kind of decline across the board in rule of law and respect for property rights. Regulation of credit, labor, and business have gone up. Same with freedom of trade. The time it takes to clear customs has gone up, I think, 4-fold since 9/11. Now, again, that might make sense, but that's a barrier to exchange and inhibiting the economic freedom of our folks to trade with individuals abroad. Okay. Yes?
How much of that is consumption, and is that weighted at all by the borrowing rates?
I'm sorry, what part of consumption?
Oh, government consumption, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
How much of that is government consumption, or how much of the portion?
Oh, of these scores.
The United States is government consumption.
It's not very.
How much is weighted by, if at all, by borrowing rates, budgeted rates there?
Yeah, so those two items are going to show up. So each of those 5 areas gets 20% of the weight of that score. So government consumption is 1/4 of 20%, so it's 5%. And so that 3 percentage points is a small part of that. So it's not a lot. It actually takes several different things changing to see it. So we've declined by 0.5 percentage point on our scale, which you need lots of things to kind of move in the same direction to have that. But that's a very good point. Like, we've gone here in government investment, so government borrowing to pay for that affects both government consumption and this investment variable.
And do the borrowing rates show up at all? Like, it might be wise to borrow money when it's cheap for the government, and for government consumption at that point.
So the rates don't matter at all. All that matters is the share of investment that the government's consuming.
Okay.
Okay, so again, we want to keep that question of like, is X a good decision separate from that?
Sure.
So we can look and correlate the two and see, okay, given that we think it's a good decision, does it have any unintended consequences? Okay. So here's some other countries, major countries. We have Germany, France, Turkey, just other countries that have been in the news a lot lately or are large. I want to highlight the colors here. Blue is the top 25% of our 152. So the most free countries are blue. The second group is green. Right? So if you look at this map on the cover of the book, you can see like the US is blue. Okay, they're in the top 25%. Green is the second, yellow is the third quartile, and the red's the bottom. So a country like China that's made tremendous improvements is still in the bottom quartile in terms of economic freedom. Now, I mentioned earlier, I want to highlight some things. I think, like all measurements, they have their issues. I think our measures for the average person in Luxembourg are more appropriate than for the average person in China, right? You still haven't need internal passports in China, right? If you want to go live in Beijing, you need permission to do so if you're coming from one of the Western provinces. So I don't have good thing, but my guess is some of those Eastern provinces are like France, right? They're not like super economically free, but they're pretty economically free. And some of those Western provinces are more like Venezuela. So we have greater measurement error in a big country with wide variation like China. Here's just the least free: Algeria, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Republic of the Congo, and Venezuela. And just think about it, there's over 200 countries in the world. Who are we not? We're not measuring Cuba. Just don't have. My sense, right, is either you're so small. If we don't rate you, you're so small. We have 97% of the world's population we rate. If we don't rate you, either you're not open, like North Korea or Cuba, where you don't have good enough data, or you're too small, like Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein's pretty economically free, but they don't make data. Okay, what have I learned about well-being? If I go back and can smack my younger self upside the head, I would say stop talking about the Scandinavian welfare states. It's really, in terms of economic freedom, it's a bias from looking at the size of government. In terms of overall economic freedom, these Scandinavian are free. People have private homes, private cars, right? There's some things different, obviously, but largely by the standards of both the measurement that we measure them and the current stand over time and the standards of today in the world, they're economically free economies, right? You don't have things like before he passed away, right? Chavez went to a hotel and had poor service, so he nationalized it, right? That doesn't happen in these countries. It's not the size of government. So here I have government consumption as a percentage of total consumption. So Timor-Leste, 59.4% of all dollars spent on consumption of water, of books, it's made collectively. Government does it. These are the 10 highest in the world in 2012. Okay, 10 highest countries in terms of government consumption. Look at the colors. Do we see any pattern? Not really. There's more blues than anything else, but you also have 2 reds, a yellow, and 2 greens. Government consumption, it's what you do with it. Do you use tax revenue to provide stable monetary policy, strong legal system, national defense that protects your citizens' rights, or do you use it to reward your friends and keep your enemies off of you? If you just told me, I'll pay you $20,000 and to go live for a year, well, let's say, I'll pay you $100,000 to go live for a year in any country in the top 10%, the top 10 of government consumption, I would say no. Because it's just too risk. I mean, I might end up in Luxembourg, but I'd also might end up in Timor-Leste. But if you made me the same deal, you wouldn't even have to offer me, you could offer me $10,000. I'd do it without thinking if you said the top 10 in property rights protection. This is our measure of property rights. 0 is not, lack of property rights protection. 10, really high property rights protection. These are all top 10. And these numbers here are their overall rankings. These are all advanced economies. All be nice places to live. Any of those would be fine. So if, for whatever reason, I think this is an important empirical question that we don't have the answer to, if countries are able to solve the social dilemma, how do you get, either through norms or through government protection, people not to respect other people's private property and not take their stuff? That's the route to prosperity. And you can support a very large welfare state if you can solve that problem. Yes?
I'm sure this is dealt with, but just because it's not obvious to me, it seems like there could very easily be a correlation causation problem here, right? So in other words, as any nation becomes wealthier, the idea that they're going to instill property rights regimes such that they're going to be protective of the wealthy's ability to hold on to that property strikes me as a very natural political thing to occur, right? In other words, as you are sort of serving the rich elite in your country, you're going to provide a very robust property rights regime so they can do what they want to with their wealth, and so they're ensured that their wealth will be protected.
I thought you were going to ask a different thing, which is it could be the fact that if you're developed, you might just be more likely to say in these surveys that our property rights are protected. I think as an empirical, it's hard to separate the two. So I think one thing that's missing from this is time. And certainly, so let's use, have you ever heard of Charles Beard? Charles Beard's a Marxist historian, wrote this famous book, An Economic History of the U.S. Constitution in 1913, where he argued that a large part of the U.S. Constitution was really just crass economic interests of the elite. And I think there's a lot to that argument, right? I think that whatever institutions you have to serve somebody's interest, and that's the interest of those in power at a particular point in time. The question is, how do these are pretty widespread measures of property rights, right? I mean, they're wide, relatively wide poles. So how do you get it where it goes from, if you think of the US example, a really narrow group of folks and becomes more widespread? I think that's the difficult. So I tend to think, I don't think there's a lot of selection bias from that point, at least in a relative standing. From a relative standing, there's so much less property rights protections in more inegalitarian, cronyistic, non-democratic countries, if that helps answer the question.
Yeah, it does. I look at the list you have there, and you have, for example, just Qatar, Norway. These are both resource-rich nations, right? And I think the others also are often benefited by resources. Qatar almost undoubtedly has not become prosperous because of an economic freedom model, but in one in which they gained wealth, they were likely to then instill a property rights regime. I guess that sort of issue is the one.
That's a great point. And I think one of the issues we have here, just looking at these 10. Right, is we think of, we're kind of what economists call sampling on the dependent variable. So if I go back here, if I think about like Singapore, Well, it's easy to have, if you're a small nation state with a deep port and trades in port, it's easy to adopt institutions consistent with economic freedom because that's the way you need to prosper. But we don't simultaneously also think of like Cuba. And why do we not have, why do they not pick up those institutions? There's good historical reasons maybe why that's not. So I guess I always think of this in terms of, for every Qatar, there's another country that has similar resources and it leads to bad, right? Or like another one would be a post-colonial, Botswana. Botswana is like one of the most economically free sub-Saharan African countries. The reason why they're economically free, and after Lesotho and South Africa, one of the most prosperous, is they made the decision after independence that they would not have a military. That was a really risky decision, but they said, look, we're desperately poor. We can't afford to devote a large percentage of funding to the military. Besides, what's the biggest threat to us? It's not people outside our country coming and taking us over. It's a military coup. So if we don't have a standing military, we're not going to have a chance to have a military coup. And so because they weren't devoting that money to the military, they could devote it to infrastructure and things. And eventually, they survived long enough where now they're much more prosperous than countries that have continued to go through coups. So it's easy to look at these and see, oh, it was an easy decision. I'm not trying to say these institutions are easy to adopt. At this point, it's just really just correlations, right? But I do think that this is why I'm pessimistic about the US. What country don't you see on here? Worldwide, economic freedoms increased a lot, but it's things we can change on a piece of paper. How do we change the top marginal tax rate? Cross out the old one, write the new one down. How do we get rid of military conscription? Stroke of Nixon's pen. How do we get back the rule of law? How do we get back protection of property, strong property rights, right? Where people feel like they can invest. It's like, how do you turn around a neighborhood where people don't feel safe to go out at night? I don't know. That's a collective problem that's not easily solved. And so I think one of the big important areas of research is to better understand each of these stories. How did they get there? Is it luck? Is it natural resources? What role does human agency play in somebody making the case for, we need to do, like in Botswana, right? So I think this is a thin slice, and we need more thick kind of case study. Does that answer? Good. Thanks. Okay, these are just some correlated. Yeah, question.
Real quick with the last two, are those the most correlated and least correlated with the rankings?
No, they're just kind of things so these are just part of the rankings. Both these are just part of the rankings. So they're just the top 10 in those two areas. But they're things that I think from years of looking are the most things I've learned. I mean, I always thought property rights are important, but they're really important. And I used to think government consumption was really important, and I don't think it's important at all. It's what you do with it, right? Like, I mean, yes. I mean, I think I would have a problem if the U.S. suddenly went up to 60%, especially given how I think crony and, especially given our geographic nature of politics, we would not fairly and evenly disperse. Like if you said, oh, we're going to have a 60%, government consumption 60%, but we're going to use it to fund basic incomes. We're just going to give everybody, we're going to take that up, we're going to divide it by the population and just give it to people. Okay. I think that might be okay. I think that might work well, but in our political system, that's not going to happen. Right? What do we think? Politics matter. Who's politically powerful? More money. Look, I come from West Virginia. We have 63 things named after Robert Byrd. We have 3 different things on the same highway, the different parts of the highway named for Robert Byrd. Why? Because he brought the pork, home. And so that, you're always in this, there's trade-offs, right? Type of thing. And So I see this as like pushing back against, like when I ask my students which country is more economically free, the US or Canada, they all say the US. And I'm like, why do you think that? And what do you think they say? Well, there's America, but there's what policy? What policy besides America?
Income tax.
That's not usually what they point at. It's a more. What's in the news now? What's everybody worried about?
The healthcare.
Healthcare. For them, like you cannot be economically free if the government pays a slightly higher percentage or has more control over healthcare. And I'm like, dude, there's other things besides. Don't mess with their housing markets as much. They didn't have nearly the economic downturn in the housing markets. They don't mess with interest rates and try to encourage housing like we do. I mean, there's so many dimensions where they're much more economically free. But anyway, I think the difference between them and us is not that great. The real difference is, Venezuela, Argentina, versus the United States. Okay, I'm just going to do some correlations real quick. Every single one starts least free in red, most free. These are correlations, not causations, but gives you a sense of the wide disparities. So incomes, per capita income, $6,253 in the least free quartile, right? And so you have the Chinas and you have Democratic Republics of Congos averaged in here. And the most free, you have the Luxembourgs and Japans, and then Chile, which is in that is there at the top and has much lower per capita income averaged in there. As an economist, I find this more puzzling. These are growth rates, adjusting for the initial level of income. The least free countries should grow faster than the more free countries. Like if you think about us, how do you grow? Growth comes from technological innovation, finding newer, cheaper ways to do things. So we have to spend resources to invent things. But most of the things we invent the idea can be copied at almost zero cost. So it's often easier for other countries to catch up. But they're not catching up, right? They're growing at a slower rate. So if we care about the well-being in terms of incomes of folks in the bottom three, it's problematic that something about the institutions are not letting ideas, spread to those countries such that they can grow at a rate that will allow them to catch up to us. How am I doing on time? Good?
An hour?
Okay.
20 minutes?
This is just a survey article. Okay, so getting back to that Samuelson quote, it was not all too clear to economists that more economic freedom be related to growth. DeHaan is kind of a skeptic of economic freedom index, and he did this study of all the published papers that looked at economic freedom and growth. And he says it's pretty clear from these studies that EF seems to have a positive association with growth, and none of the studies summarize reports that economic freedom is bad for growth. If we think about income share, so let's not look at overall income. Let's look at the bottom 10%. The poorest of the poor. In each country, the World Bank provides income levels for the bottom 10%. And income shares. Not much difference in terms of income shares across quartiles. Okay, under 3% goes to the bottom 10%. But people don't eat income shares; they eat out of income. I wouldn't want to live on $11,000 a year. At the same time, it's better than $13.58. And again, these are adjusting for purchasing power parity, so it's adjusting for levels of what a dollar will buy in each country. So as best we can be comparable across countries. Joe Connors did his dissertation at Florida State. This is a snapshot of his dissertation on economic institutions and global poverty. And he looks at the measure of $2 a day. There were people living on less than $2 a day. And we've seen great declines in the number of people living on less than $2 a day. And he explores to what extent does the increase in economic freedom, primarily in just two countries, China and India, play in this. And he finds that countries that experienced increase in economic freedom had larger reductions in this extreme poverty rate. And this kind of just shows, like if you think about China, China's not economically free at all, but it's a lot freer than it used to be. And that little bit of economic freedom, especially in the eastern provinces, has really led to tremendous increase in living standards. So there's a lot, you name it, I could do this all day long with these bar charts. I just want to show life expectancy because I want to highlight the fact that, look, I think most of this goes through income. People have higher incomes. What do you want to spend it on? I don't care about dollars, right? I care about what dollars get me. And one of the things dollars might get me is better health care, right? I might take better care of myself. I might work less. We've certainly seen that in the United States. I teach American economic history, and we just kind of plot over time the number of hours worked. And my students are always amazed that, like, oh, wait, the first labor law in Massachusetts in 1842 restricted children under the age of 12 to a 6-day work week? Wait, they were working more than a 6-day work week? We needed a law to restrict them to a 6-day work week? And people were still working on average 56 hours, right? Kind of pre-Great Depression. So all those things contribute to this difference in life expectancy, health, better sanitation, all that stuff, right? So I don't think it's like, oh, I'm more economically free, now I'm going to live longer, right? That doesn't work that way. Why does economic freedom lead to more economic growth? I think, properly understood, economic freedom leads to more entrepreneurship. There have been a lot of studies looking at this. This is just one of those, a paper in a journal called Public Choice by a Norwegian economist, Christina Nystrom, and she finds that a smaller government sector, better legal structure, and security of property rights, as well as regulations, tend to increase entrepreneurship, right? But it's not just, we don't want to just necessarily have more entrepreneurship. It's not just business starts. It's not propping up business failures, right? I mean, really, a market economy is about an opportunity to learn. How do we know if people want certain goods? Well, somebody brings together, using their own capital and the capital of others, raw materials and produces a good that might cost a couple of dollars. And if it provides value, people are willing to spend more than a couple of dollars to buy it from them. And if they're not willing to spend more than a couple of dollars, that's a sign, man, you wasted resources. You took that capital from investors, you took those things that had other uses, and you made us all poorer as a result. Right? It's like that line, if you've ever seen Billy Madison, the end of Billy Madison, you guys have seen that movie with Adam Sandler. He's like, we're all dumber for having listened to you. Well, every time an entrepreneur fails, I think, man, we're all poorer. And I'm fine with that, and we should be fine with that, entrepreneurial failure, because it's necessary to discover the things that people do want. That's how we get progress. And if you look across countries, the countries with the highest rate of business failures also have the highest startup rates. Trying to keep business failures low is a way of keeping entrepreneurship low. Because where do the resources come for new startups? They come from businesses that fail. Okay. And this is the problem. This is why I go talk to businesses about economic freedom. They're like, oh, we love talking about economic freedom, America. And they don't like my story because what am I saying? We need to stop socializing losses. You guys talk about economic freedom a lot, but really, when it comes time to get bailouts, if things aren't going well, you're first in line. right? So as a economist, I used to have a blog, and at a part, it was getting a little crowded. I would say I would tag stuff would say why I stand alone at parties, which is I guess something you have to get used to as an economist. So what's the big picture? The big picture is I wanted to know, maybe I'm biased. There's clearly an ideology here. There's an ideology behind the index. I like to think I'm open, I'm transparent. Here's what the ideology is. And then we put the data out there and let people do what they will with it. And I want to get a good handle of what are people doing with it. So I went to this index, you probably have it in your library, Social Science Citation Index. My co-author and I, Bob Lawson, went in there. And we looked at, we searched for what you can do is you can search for the things that cite you. So we searched for the articles that cite us. And there's 214 different journals across economics, political science, international relations, marketing, management, finance, forestry. You name it, there are articles using this index. What's the collective wisdom of people who, maybe they cared about economic freedom, maybe they didn't care about economic freedom, they thought it was an important thing to control for statistically. And we went through and we read, my co-author and I read all 405 of these. And we coded them. How did they cite us? Did they just throw away, as this measure of neoliberalism says, Gortney et al.? That's a lot. So was it a throwaway citation? Okay, several throwaway citations. Is it good or bad? So is there finding relationship between economic freedom and other things, good or bad? So if it's a bad thing, right, is it negatively related, meaning economic freedom goes up, that bad thing goes down, less of that bad thing? Or if it's a good thing, is economic freedom positively related to it? And then we were concerned about bias. Do people who use the word economic freedom to describe the data, do they come to different results than people who use the word neoliberalism or market-oriented institutions or whatever? Because, I like to think that those relationships hold across a wide range, but maybe it's just we do things that conform to our priors. And so what did we find? This is just a word cloud that has all of those the abstracts of all of those articles. So you can kind of see what people are interested in. They're interested in economic freedom. This is weighted by the number of times it appears. So larger letters, larger font means it appeared more. So growth, we care about growth. Corruption, right? Human, developing, political. So sense of what some people are looking at. Here's what I want to highlight is this middle part. Don't worry about the core, non-core, except look at the mostly good column. These are all the empirical papers of all the empirical papers, most of them are in the mostly good part. There are only 8 that are in the mostly bad part. And then a handful that are either there's no effect, it's a mixed effect, some regressions, it's positive, some there's no effect, some it might be negative, or it has a relation but it's not statistically significant. Those all go in here. And we bent over backwards to put stuff in the mostly bad. Like, in fact, one of the referees on our paper said, you characterized this paper, these 2 papers as mostly bad. And I disagree. I think maybe that person was the referee for the article. And I said, well, I think that's evidence that we were really bending over backwards to err on the side of putting things in the mostly bad. And that's all we could come up with. Yes?
Of the mostly bad, what particular journals did those come from?
Economics. Economics, and most importantly, one of the papers early papers looking at the index said, well, this index is related to growth, but a lot of these studies are in this journal called Public Choice that's going to be predisposed to finding that relationship. And almost half of these, mostly bad, are in that journal. So again, that made me feel good, at least about the editors of that journal, is that they were willing to publish those results and weren't biased in the way this other author thought. But so there's a typo here. This should be 8 out of, since there's 3 and 5, it should be 8 here. So I apologize. I noticed that when I gave this talk earlier today. 8 out of 170 empirical papers. It's less than 4% of the sample. 3 of these bad articles, so some of the stuff might be like environmental. You often find, this is true with life expectancy. When Britain was going through the Industrial Revolution, life expectancy fell. Because what do people do when growth happens? They go to cities. Cities are cesspools, bad sanitation, that time, right? I mean, people just put their sewage out in the street, and so disease was rampant. And life expectancy fell in Britain for like 50 years. But in the long run, growth tends to be positive with life expectancy. Well, 3 of the papers, and the same might be true with environmental quality in the near term, right? Economic freedom leads to growth, which tends to lead to less, dirtier air. Pittsburgh, just north of West Virginia, was that way in the 70s. You could barely see. China, parts of China now. But then eventually people demand more environmental quality, and the environment tends to improve. So 3 of the bad articles indicate that more economic freedom leads to another typo, greater income inequality. I thought I had fixed that. Greater income inequality. Okay, and these papers seem to be consistent with there's some trade-off between growth and income equality. So higher growth, that tends to get captured at the top of the income distribution, right? I think we have some innovation, right? Cruise to Silicon Valley, Route 128 in Boston. Gini coefficients, measures of inequality go up, even though growth's rising. However, that's only one measure of inequality. There's other measures of social inequality. Some people have looked at gender equality, so convergence of labor force participation, convergence of wage gaps, and finds that more economic freedom leads to convergence between men and women on those dimensions. Berggren and Nilsson look at tolerance. There's this thing called a World Values Survey that surveys people in a large number of countries about their opinions on a wide number of values. And they find that economic freedom fosters a greater toleration of others, including sexual orientations. So my kind of big takeaway is all those things that those diverse group of scholars looked at. I mean, I just got a citation the other day. Apparently, there's a Journal of Heavy Metal Music Studies, and someone found that more economic freedom leads to a greater number of heavy metal bands per capita. I think it's first of all, I don't want to downgrade. It's a weird thing to study, but I actually think that they're just mismeasuring things because it's all driven by all those Norwegian, Scandinavian death metal bands. And if they just put a dummy variable, if you're in for that, probably economic freedom wouldn't matter. But all these authors pursuing these they're looking at deforestation. They don't care about economic freedom. They just put it in there because they think it's a control. And lo and behold, more economic freedom, less deforestation, which we would expect. Property rights, right? Where's our most egregious clear cutting? It occurs on public lands, right? Like someone comes and wants to clear cut like trees of my own that have value. I'm not going to let them do that. I was going to stop them, right? Same thing with all the trees. Walmart's been trying to help. A lot of their furniture was being built by trees that were being smuggled out of Russia. right? But what's the problem? The problem is like they don't. They're public trees. They don't pay their forest people at all, and so they just look the other way. In fact, maybe they get small bribes to let them come in and harvest these trees. So I think there's some really important questions remain, but I think it taught me a lot, and hopefully you. Yeah.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, all these measurements are sort of nation-bound within nation states. But what about the measurement of economic freedom of countries that afford this freedom because then they go and use other property resources of other countries and so on and so forth. So, I mean, do you capture this at all, or?
So I guess you were saying like, we're using oil from other countries or.
Oil, yeah, and but you can say they go and deforest the Amazonian forest for their own purposes. They allow multinationals to go anywhere else in the world to use sort of their resources and to somehow then benefit of the gains that can come from them.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question because there are really like three parts to this. One is ideally what would I like to measure? I'd like to measure for individuals, right? Because really what I want people who are able to learn how to live and be free, autonomous individuals, right? And yet I'm measuring nations because that's the data we have. The second part of I think your answer is what are the relationships? How does freedoms of economic freedom in some countries interact with the economic freedoms in others? Right? Like if country A becomes more economically free, does its neighbor's economic freedom go down or go up? There's been some work on this. The paper called Contagious Capitalism uses the index, and they find that you catch some of your neighbor's freedom. Usually that's because if they open up, like think about something like trade, you become more open to trade, they're more likely to become open to trade. The question about kind of exploiting, it's unclear to me how that affects the long run institutions. I don't think it's helpful for those countries, right? Certainly, like the issue of oil, 80% of all oil is owned by countries. It's not owned by companies. And so it's hard to say, well, we should try to buy only things we know are purely freely exchanged oil. Like it's just not, I don't think it's something that's possible to do. But that being said, I don't know where that line is between there's acts that I know I wouldn't engage in, but countries do on our behalf, right? I don't know, I guess I'm ignorant on that, but I think it's an important point, right? Like I think it was good that people brought Walmart to bear on the extent to which they were using these pirated trees out of Russia, right? Like, I don't think it's a good thing that these trees were being pirated out of Russia, and the extent that it was all Walmart suppliers that were buying these trees. The fact that Walmart was able to do a good thing by putting pressure, just as Walmart can put pressure down the supply chain to keep prices low, they can put pressure down the supply chain to buy trees that aren't stolen. Yeah.
I was saying, and this is sort of the flip side of what Lorenzo was asking about, but it seems that if the general thesis is that more economic freedom, kind of in a sort of roughly linear sense, right,
Yeah.
leads to kind of all of these various goods coming about, it seems to me that it might be useful to look intranationally, right? So if you were to look within the United States, I mean, the United States is a perfect example because we have a federal system by which we have 50 states, and one could look at the various property regimes that exist within each one of those 50 states. And that made me think that the most recent empirical data I've seen on that actually suggests the opposite. So the states with essentially much more loose laissez-faire property regimes like Louisiana, like Texas, like a lot of the southern states, actually receive a lot more federal subsidies. They receive more money from the central government in large part because of higher poverty rates than, in fact, more highly regulated regimes like in Massachusetts or in California. And I was wondering if you've, in fact, essentially taken some of these things and then thought about them within that international realm, because you do avoid a lot of the problems that can exist just generally within different societies that have all sorts of other variables that are at play.
Yeah, I think so. There is, if you were to go to freetheworld.com, there's measures of economic freedom at both the MSA level in the United States and the state level. There's Indian provinces, there's Chinese provinces. They call it market orientation. They can't use freedom, so they use market orientation. And you're right. You hit it right on the head that the federalist nature makes it somewhat difficult in the U.S. because to look at things like growth, because you could get more money because of your status, right? And I also think it's complicated in the U.S. for a different reason, right? So like, let's say we looked at New York State. What sort of information, and let's say we see New York State incomes are high, but growth rates are low relative to, let's say, Texas. What do we learn from that? And I'll tell you, its economic freedom score is pretty low. What do we learn from that? Well, we could say, it's bad for growth rates, but they're still relatively wealthy. I think the interesting question is not what economic freedom is today. It's what was economic freedom? What caused you to grow in the first place? Right? Like in some ways, we can afford more. Like I think I was much freer when I didn't have kids and didn't have all the trappings of being an adult. I think when you're growing, you need a lot of economic freedom. You might not need a lot of economic freedom today, or you can afford to have less economic freedom. If you're New York State, maybe if you're Mississippi or West Virginia, right, we need more economic freedom. But even at the state level, there's these correlations. They're not as strong because the variation.
And that makes me wonder, actually, if it really is linear that you're shooting at here, or if it's threshold, right? So in other words, is it just that once you get past a threshold, right, that essentially the remainder is kind of diminishing returns, doesn't much matter? Or essentially, is it truly kind of, do you believe it's truly linear?
I don't think you can answer, I don't think you can answer that. I think that's a great, with what we do, right? Because I view what we do answering the general question. Like I said, it's a very thin, we're looking across countries. I can't answer, I got 42 variables in there, right? So you have countries that have the same exact score. Canada and Luxembourg, like those are, I'm sorry, that's property rights. Let's go. You have Brazil and India. They have very close scores, or Russia and Brazil have very close scores. They have them for very different reasons, right? And one might be strong. I'm not using those examples. You could have two countries with identical scores, and one have them because they have very strong property rights protection, right? And I think the outcomes from those are going to be different than a country that is stronger in other areas. So we have what economists call like an identification problem, in that we're measuring this outcome. It's like a market where we can measure the price. We see what the price is, but we don't know what's sold and how much it's sold and what demand is for it, right? So we can't really infer anything from a price about really what demand was. We couldn't say a lot of people demanded that because we don't know how much supply was. So I guess my saying is, the way I think this causes us to go into it and look at individual countries and then say, okay, what was going on at this time? And then do you see these threshold in these case studies? Do you see this? And there was a guy in Spain, an economic historian, who's now developed for OECD countries economic freedom measures going back to 1870. And okay, can we then see for those countries I think now we're going to be able to do more of that stuff for a much longer time span. I know it's not a satisfying answer, but I think that's the best thing to be done, kind of something that's aggregate. All the aggregate tells you is general relationships, and then let's look closer at specific things that make you go, hey, this seems to be an outlier. Well, let's understand why that's an outlier. Or let's understand these two have the same score, but for very different reasons. What's the differential impact of that? Yes?
Tying into that, I would just like to point out there are complicating historical factors in America within at the state level. For example, the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction has left a certain legacy of economic disparity between the southern states and the rest of the country. So on and so forth. That was just
Yeah, well, this is an interesting, so one of the last, I think the really interesting thing is trying to explain why some countries have, one of these big questions is why some countries have, some states have high levels of economic freedom. Like, why is Delaware? Delaware is like always, it's like the Hong Kong and Singapore of the state economic freedom, and other states don't. And I think we can look at the U.S. South. Most of the U.S. South has low economic levels of economic freedom on all these rankings. And I think the reason why historically is the legacy of slavery, right? Slavery led to a whole host of bad political and economic institutions. I study, one of the other things hats I wear is I study schooling markets. And one thing we've learned is more choice, and that can be public school district choice, like you just have more school districts. So like, for example, in Boston, for historical reasons, there's 80 school districts within a 25-minute drive of downtown Boston, right? Most of the South has county school districts. Why do they have county school districts? Well, how do you have a big enough catchment area to have separate black and white schools? You need to go to the county level to have enough kids to have a black high school. And so that legacy of slavery means there's not a lot of public school competition, which I think still hurts the South educationally today compared to New England states. And that's history determined. So the bigger question is, how do you then use that to inform policy and political decision making today? I don't know. I'm going to punt on that, but okay. Yeah, thank you for the great questions. I really appreciate it. And if you're ever doing something, if you go to the site, you can pull up any particular country and look at its trajectory. And we have abstracts and not only the data, everything that's in here. And by the way, if anybody wants this, I don't want to take it back with me. We have the data and everything that's in here on there, and as well as the abstracts to those 400 plus studies. So it's like an instant literature review, so you can kind of see what people have done. So thank you.
Thank you.